I had decided to spend the weekend at a ranger's cabin deep in the mountains. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden shack with a bunk bed, an old wood stove, and a table. I wasn't a ranger, but this cabin was open to hikers and hunters needing a place to rest. I liked staying there because it was far from everything, no phone signal, no distractions. Just me, the forest, and the wind. The first night was uneventful. I lit a fire in the wood stove, read for a bit, and drifted off to sleep to the soft creaking of the old cabin. The next morning, I decided to hike further up the trail. It was cold, and the air felt fresh and sharp. I spotted deer tracks in the dirt and heard the faint sound of a stream in the distance. I spent most of the day out there, soaking in the peace. By the time I got back, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. That's when I saw it. The door to the cabin was slightly open. I stopped in my tracks, staring at it. I was sure I had locked it before leaving. My chest tightened, and I felt uneasy. At first, I thought maybe I had been careless and hadn't closed it properly. But as I got closer, I saw footprints in the dirt leading up to the door. They didn't match my boots. I stood there for a while, just staring at the cabin. My mind tried to reason with me. Maybe it was just an animal or another hiker passing by. But the prints were too clear, too precise. Someone had been here. I felt a wave of panic. The idea of hiking back to my car in the dark wasn't appealing, but the thought of walking into the cabin made my stomach churn. Still, I forced myself to step inside, hoping whoever it was had already moved on. The cabin looked the same as I had left it. My bag was still in the corner, untouched. My gear was all there, but something about the room felt wrong, like the air was heavier. I quickly shut and locked the door, this time dragging a chair against it to make sure no one could push their way in. I tried to shake the feeling off and sat on the bed, gripping my hunting knife. I told myself I'd stay awake for a while, just to be sure. Sometime around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps outside, crunching slowly in the dirt. The sound was soft but steady, circling the cabin. My chest tightened, and I could feel my heart pounding. I froze, gripping the knife in one hand and staring at the door. The steps stopped, and everything went silent. Then, there was a faint tap on the window. My throat went dry. I didn't move. I didn't want to look. A second tap came, louder this time. It wasn't frantic. It was slow and deliberate, like whoever was out there wanted me to know they were still there. I sat frozen for hours, clutching the knife so tightly my hand ached. The footsteps eventually faded, and the tapping stopped, but I didn't relax. I stayed awake, staring at the door, listening for any sound. The next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the window. I hadn't realized I had fallen asleep until I heard voices outside. I peeked through the curtain and saw a group of men in uniform. They were rangers. I opened the door, my legs shaky, and they asked if I was okay. I nodded, but I couldn't find the words to speak. One of the rangers explained they were searching for a man who had been on the run for weeks after a violent crime in a nearby town. They said he was dangerous and possibly armed. They mentioned they had found fresh tracks near the cabin and advised me to leave with them for my own safety. I didn't argue. As we hiked down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see movement in the trees. When we were a good distance away, I turned back for one last look at the cabin. That's when I saw it. A piece of paper stuck to the window, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I couldn't read it from where I stood, but I knew it hadn't been there before. The rangers hadn't mentioned it, and I wasn't about to go back to check. I kept walking, my stomach twisting. Later that night, after I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about that paper. It haunted me. I finally decided to check the trail camera I had left near the cabin. It was set to capture anything that moved while I was gone. The first few photos were normal, deer passing by, birds in the trees. But then I saw him, a man standing outside the cabin in the middle of the night, staring at the door. His face wasn't clear, but his posture was. He wasn't wandering. He was waiting. The last photo made my blood run cold. It was taken just before dawn while I was asleep. The man was standing inches from the window, staring directly at the camera, his hand pressed against the glass. I never went back to that cabin, and I never found out what was written on that piece of paper. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can hear faint footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, just like before. I thought it would be a peaceful weekend, just me and the sound of rain in a small village cabin. I rented it to get some quiet time and escape the noise of the city. The village was tiny, hidden deep in the hills. The cabin was right at the edge of a thick forest, far from the rest of the village. It was simple but cozy, with wooden walls that made little creaking sounds when the wind hit them. The rain started soon after I arrived in the afternoon. It wasn't just a drizzle. It poured hard, turning the dirt paths around the cabin into slippery mud. By night, it was coming down even heavier, hammering on the roof and windows. The power kept flickering, so I lit some candles. Their dim light made shadows on the walls, which seemed to move whenever the flames flickered. I was trying to read a book, listening to the storm outside, when I heard a sound that didn't fit. It was a faint tapping noise. At first, I thought it was just part of the rain, but it had a pattern to it. It wasn't random. I put my book down and listened closely. The sound came again, this time clearer and closer. It seemed to be coming from the back of the cabin, near the door that opened to the forest. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a branch knocking against the cabin. But when I went to check, I saw there weren't any trees close enough to touch the walls. The tapping came again. It sounded like it was right on the door now, soft but steady. My stomach sank, and my hands felt cold. The rain was loud, but I listened as hard as I could, trying to catch any other noise. Nothing, just the tapping and the storm. I decided to ignore it, thinking maybe it was some animal trying to get out of the rain. I went back to the little living room, sat down, and tried to focus on my book again. But the sound wouldn't stop. It wasn't changing or moving. It stayed the same, slow and steady. Then it hit me it wasn't random at all. It sounded like someone lightly knocking, as if they didn't want to be too loud. My skin crawled at the thought. I grabbed a flashlight from the side table and checked the locks on all the windows and doors. Everything was locked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tapping stopped after a while, and I started to feel silly for being so jumpy. I convinced myself it was just the wind playing tricks. But as I sat back down, I heard a floorboard creak behind me. My heart raced as I slowly turned around and shone the flashlight toward the kitchen. Nothing. I swept the light across the room, checking every corner. Still nothing, but something felt off. The air felt heavy, like someone was in the room, watching. I couldn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The tapping was gone, but the silence felt worse. I went to the bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the bed with the flashlight in my lap. The rain was still loud, but I stayed awake, listening for anything out of place. Hours passed like that, my body stiff with fear. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the faint light of morning coming through the curtains. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle. I felt a little foolish for being so scared. I told myself I had probably just let my imagination run wild. I stepped outside to check the cabin's surroundings. The ground was soaked, and the grass was flattened in spots where puddles had formed. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Bare footprints, leading from the forest to the back door of the cabin. They weren't mine. They weren't from any animal. Someone had been out there, walking barefoot in the rain, right up to my door. The prints didn't end at the door. They circled around the cabin and then led back into the forest. My chest tightened as I stared at them, trying to make sense of it. Someone had stood outside in the storm, watching the cabin. Watching me. I couldn't stay there another second. I didn't even pack my things. I grabbed my car keys and left. I drove straight onto the main road, not stopping until the cabin was far behind me. A few days later, I got a call from the cabin owner. He wanted to know why I had left the place unlocked when I left. I froze. I knew I had locked the door when I left. He said something else, too. When he went to check the cabin, he found muddy footprints inside, leading from the back door to the bedroom, the same bedroom where I had spent the night. Whoever it was hadn't left after the rain stopped. They had been inside with me, waiting. I live in a small, remote community in northern Alberta, Canada. Our town has a population of about 350 people. Winters here are brutal, with temperatures often dropping to minus 40 degrees Celsius. But for many of us, that's the way we like it, isolated and peaceful. Every winter, my friend Connor's cousin, Kyle, and his parents head out to their cabin deep in the wilderness to go ice fishing. Their cabin is about 60 kilometers from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but thick, snow-covered forest. They go there every year like clockwork, always returning with plenty of fish and stories about the cold, quiet isolation. Kyle, who was 17 at the time, usually hated it. He complained about how boring it was, how the nights felt too quiet, and how the distant howls of wolves always seemed to set him on edge. But one year, something happened that ensured none of them ever returned. It was January 2005. Kyle's family left town early in the morning, loaded with supplies for a week-long trip. It had been a cold winter, and the snow was piled high, blanketing the roads and trees. When they arrived at the cabin, they spent the first day settling in, unpacking, clearing snow, and getting their ice fishing gear ready. They had a small ice hut set up on the frozen lake nearby, about a 5-minute walk from the cabin. The first 2 days went by uneventfully. Kyle was bored out of his mind, as usual, complaining about the cold and the eerie sounds of animals at night. But the third night was different. Around 1 a.m., Kyle was startled awake by a loud thud against the cabin wall, followed by the agonizing cries of what sounded like an injured deer. The sound was unsettling, high-pitched and desperate. It sent a chill through Kyle, but he tried to brush it off, assuming it was just some predator taking down its prey. Still, he couldn't shake the unease that settled over him. The next morning, Kyle decided to investigate the source of the noise. He bundled up in his parka and stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The snow around the cabin was undisturbed, but as he walked around to the back, he found something that made his stomach drop. There was a large pool of blood staining the snow. Surrounding it were wolf tracks, unmistakable in the fresh powder. But what stood out most were the human footprints, bare, unshod feet, leading from the forest to the spot where the blood had pooled. The tracks were deep, spaced unnaturally far apart, and disappeared back into the woods, dragging a trail of blood behind them. Kyle stared at the scene, trying to make sense of it. The idea of someone walking barefoot in this freezing weather seemed impossible, yet the evidence was right in front of him. He went back inside, shaken, and spent the rest of the day trying to convince himself it was nothing. His parents dismissed his concerns, saying there was no way anyone else was out here in the middle of nowhere. But Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. That night, Kyle lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening intently for any sound. Around 2 a.m., he heard it again, a loud, deliberate thud against the wall. This time, he froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He stayed in bed, clutching the blankets, trying to convince himself it was just an animal. But then he heard something else, a faint, scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the common room of the cabin. Summoning his courage, Kyle got out of bed and crept toward the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the noise. But when he peeked outside, there was nothing there. He shook his head, muttered to himself, and turned to head back to bed. That's when he heard it. A soft, deliberate knock at the cabin door. Kyle froze, his blood running cold. The knock was slow, methodical, and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side wanted him to know they were there. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking stopped. But Kyle's terror was far from over. The next morning, Kyle's father decided to check outside, insisting it was just a wild animal. But when he opened the door, he stopped in his tracks. There, written in blood on the cabin door, were 2 words, "Knock, knock." The trail of blood from the previous day was still there, leading back into the woods. But this time there were more footprints, bare, human, and impossibly large. They circled the cabin, as if whoever had left them had been watching them through the windows. Kyle's father decided it was time to leave. They packed up their things in record time and loaded everything into their truck. But when his father turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. He tried again, but it wouldn't start. Panic set in as Kyle's mother started to pray, and Kyle kept glancing out the window, his breath fogging the glass. Then he saw it. At the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line, stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and thin, with long, gangly limbs. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and it was completely naked despite the freezing temperatures. The figure took a step forward, then another, each movement slow and deliberate. Kyle screamed for his parents, but they were already scrambling to get out of the truck. His father grabbed an axe from the back, and his mother clutched Kyle's arm, pulling him toward the cabin. But as they turned to run, the figure started to move faster, its long strides eating up the distance between them in seconds. They barely made it back inside, slamming the door shut and bolting it behind them. The figure stopped just short of the door, its breath fogging the glass as it stared at them through the window. For hours, they stayed huddled in the cabin, listening to the sound of it circling the building, tapping on the windows and scratching at the walls. Then, just before dawn, the sound stopped. When they finally worked up the courage to look outside, the figure was gone. But the blood trail and footprints remained, leading back into the woods. Kyle's family left the cabin later that day, abandoning their gear and driving back to town as fast as the icy roads would allow. They never spoke about what happened, and they never returned to the cabin. To this day, the cabin remains empty, a silent monument to the terror they experienced. And whatever was out there in the woods that night, it's still out there waiting. I've heard a lot of stories about strange experiences in the woods, and I've even told a few myself. But nothing could prepare me for what happened to me 12 years ago. It was a kind of terror I had never felt before or since, and I still can't fully explain it. Even now, thinking back, I get chills, and my chest tightens as if I'm back in that moment. I'll try to share it as clearly as I can, though it won't be quick. This is going to take some time to explain, so bear with me. Before I was born, my parents built a small cabin in the western part of Colorado, nestled in the mountains. It wasn't too far from Gunnison, but it was remote enough to feel like a true escape from the world. We'd go there every chance we got. Summer vacations, long weekends, and holidays were spent up at the cabin. It became a part of me, a second home where I could explore the forests, breathe the mountain air, and let my imagination run wild. We weren't the only ones with cabins in the area. Several other families had similar setups, and over the years, my parents grew close to some of the neighbors. The adults would have cookouts and fishing trips, and us kids, well, we just roamed, We spent our days running through the woods, climbing trees, and building forts. We'd get scraped up and filthy, but we didn't care. It was freedom. One thing we never did, though, was venture onto the old property down the road. You couldn't miss it. The dirt road to our cabin cut through a wide, empty field, and right in the middle of that field was the abandoned property. There were several structures: a green two-story barn, a smaller red building that looked like a shed or maybe an old airplane hangar, and a white tractor barn. Perched on a small hill at the back of the property was the house. It was barely visible from the road, but you could make out its broken windows and peeling paint. The whole place gave off an eerie vibe, and we avoided it like the plague when we were kids. Even the tree near the house seemed wrong. It was the only tree on the entire property, but it was massive, gnarled, and always filled with crows. They'd sit there, squawking and flapping their wings like something out of a horror movie. We used to make up stories about the place. Rumors of strange noises, shadows in the windows, and things no one could explain. But none of us dared to get close, not until we were older. By the time I was 15, that fear had turned into curiosity. The stories weren't scary anymore. They were a challenge. My friends and I started going to the property during the day, sneaking through the broken fences and exploring the buildings. It was exactly what you'd expect: rotting wood, rusted tools, and piles of junk. But there was something exciting about it, like we were discovering secrets no one else knew about. One day, I found something that made my stomach drop. We were in the green workshop poking around the workbench. I opened one of the drawers and found an old notebook. It was a cheap, colorful notebook with a cartoon character on the cover, something from the late 90s. When I flipped it open, I froze. It was mine. My name was scrawled on the first page, along with the names of my siblings. We had used this notebook as kids to keep score in games and write silly notes to each other. I recognized the messy handwriting immediately, but I had no idea how it had ended up here. I showed it to my friends, but they just shrugged. None of them knew anything about it, and neither did my siblings when I asked them later. What really unnerved me, though, were the last few pages. They were filled with handwriting I didn't recognize, neat, deliberate, and completely different from the messy kid scribbles on the earlier pages. I couldn't make out all the words, but it didn't feel right. That should have been the moment we stopped going to the property. But we didn't. Over the next couple of years, we made the abandoned property our hangout spot. We even set up an area in the workshop where we could sit and talk. We'd hear the occasional creak or thump, but we always blamed it on the wind or animals. Nothing seemed dangerous, and I was always the first to brush off any concerns. That changed during the summer of 2011. I had just turned 17 and recently gotten into dirt biking. My best friend, Ethan, was the one who got me hooked. He had an older Yamaha 125 cubic centimeters dirt bike and taught me how to ride on the trails around the cabin. After months of practice, I'd saved up enough to buy my own, a Honda 200 cubic centimeters that I loved. We spent every weekend tearing up the trails, finding new routes, and pushing each other to see who could go faster. One evening in late July, we decided to ride out to the abandoned property. The monsoon rains had let up for the day, and the air was cool and crisp. We'd been riding all afternoon and wanted to end the day with a quick stop at the old barn. Ethan rode ahead on his Yamaha, and I followed close behind. We reached the driveway and pulled up in front of the hangar. I parked my bike and waited for Ethan to circle back around. He liked to loop around the buildings to check things out, so I didn't think much of it when he disappeared behind the barn. I sat there, letting my bike idle in neutral, staring at the white tractor barn. It was a massive structure with huge sliding doors on either end and smaller side doors for people to enter. Most of the doors had rotted away, leaving the interior exposed. You could see straight through to the other side, where the grass grew tall and wild. As I waited, I caught a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just the wind shifting something inside the barn. But when I turned my head, I didn't see anything move. The barn was quiet, and the shadows inside were still. I shook it off and turned my attention back to the driveway, listening for the sound of Ethan's bike. Then I saw it. A pale hand reached around the edge of the barn door. It was thin, almost skeletal, with skin so white it seemed to glow in the fading light. The fingers were long and bony, and they gripped the door frame like they were testing it. My heart started to race, but I couldn't look away. Another hand appeared, lower on the frame, followed by a head. The thing that peeked around the corner was human-shaped but wrong. Its skin was the same sickly white as its hands, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. Its eyes were impossibly dark, like black holes that seemed to swallow the light around them. It stared at me, unblinking, its head tilted slightly to the side as if studying me. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. I wanted to believe it wasn't real, but then I noticed the reflection of my bike's headlight in its eyes. It wasn't my imagination. The thing smiled, its mouth stretched wide, revealing short, jagged teeth that looked more like animal fangs than human teeth. The smile didn't feel like an expression of joy or friendliness. It felt like a warning. I knew I had to move, but my hands wouldn't cooperate. My heart was pounding, and my breath came in short, panicked gasps. The creature didn't move, but its gaze never left mine. It was as if it was waiting for me to make the first move. Finally, I snapped out of my paralysis. I yanked the bike into gear and gunned the throttle, tearing down the driveway. I didn't care if Ethan was behind me. I had to get out of there. When I reached the road, I glanced back and saw Ethan following close behind. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with fear. We didn't stop until we were back at my cabin, where we both jumped off our bikes, panting and shaking. What the hell was that? Ethan finally managed to ask. I didn't answer, couldn't. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the image of that thing in the barn. Its dark eyes and sharp teeth burned into my memory. I've told this story to a few people over the years, but no one seems to believe me. Maybe that's for the best. The abandoned property was sold a few years later, and the new owners tore down most of the buildings, including the white tractor barn. Part of me is relieved it's gone, but another part of me wonders if that thing is still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for someone else to come too close. Even now, when I sit on the porch of the cabin at night, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. I took a job cutting wood in a forest far from town. It wasn't the kind of work most people would want, but the pay was good. They gave me a cabin to stay in. It was small and plain, just a bed, a little stove, and a table. The forest around it was thick and quiet, almost too quiet, except for the occasional rustling of animals. At first, I didn't mind. I liked the peace. I'd spend my days working hard, then sleep deeply at night. But as time went on, I realized something about this place felt wrong. The first few days were fine. I'd wake up early, just as the sun was coming up, and head to the trees marked for cutting. I worked until my arms and back ached, then headed back to the cabin to rest. Felt good, in a way, but then small things started happening that I couldn't explain. I'd leave my tools in one spot, only to find them in another when I came back. At first, I thought I was just tired and wasn't paying attention. Maybe I'd moved them without realizing it. But it kept happening, and it wasn't just tools. My food supplies would shift places, too. One morning, I found large footprints in the mud outside the cabin. They didn't match my boots, they were much bigger. I told myself it was probably just a hunter or someone passing by, but I couldn't figure out why anyone would come this far into the forest and get so close to my cabin. That night, for the first time, I locked the door before going to bed. After that, sleeping became harder. I started waking up in the middle of the night, feeling like I needed to listen. Sometimes, I'd hear faint snapping sounds, like someone stepping on twigs nearby. I tried telling myself it was just animals, but deep down I wasn't so sure. Then one night, I woke up to a loud bang against the side of the cabin. It was so sudden and strong that I froze in place, my heart pounding. I reached for the axe I kept by the door and stood there, holding my breath, waiting to hear it again. Nothing came after that, but I didn't go back to sleep. When the sun came up, I went outside to check. That's when I saw the marks on the cabin wall. Long, deep scratches ran down the wood where I'd heard the noise. They weren't from any animal I could think of. The lines were too deliberate. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter, but I was starting to feel scared. On what ended up being my last day there, I decided to finish early and leave. I don't know why, but something told me it wasn't safe to stay anymore. I worked quickly, cutting and stacking the wood, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around noon, I noticed something strange. The trees further out looked darker, like they were standing closer together than they had been before. It didn't make sense, but I avoided that part of the forest. As I walked back to the cabin to pack, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. My own footprints from earlier that morning were covered by new ones. They were much bigger than mine and headed straight toward the cabin. I tightened my grip on the axe and hurried back. When I got there, the cabin door was wide open. I knew for a fact I had locked it. Inside, everything was a mess. My bed was flipped over, my supplies were scattered across the floor, and those same scratch marks from outside were now carved into the walls inside. They were deeper this time, like someone or something was angry. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed what I could and ran to my truck. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and I didn't feel safe until I was driving away. Even then, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something running after me. When I finally made it back to the main road, I felt a little relief, but not much. The feeling of being watched stayed with me, like something was still out there, waiting. When I got home and started unpacking, I realized the axe I'd been holding so tightly was gone. At first, I thought I must have left it in the truck, but when I checked, it wasn't there. Instead, I found a handprint on the side of my bag. It was smeared in mud and far too big to be mine. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise outside my window made my skin crawl. The worst part? The next morning, when I opened my front door, my axe was lying on the porch. The blade was clean, but the handle was covered in fresh, muddy handprints. I went up to the cabin by myself for the weekend. It was in a tiny town out in the middle of nowhere, far from the nearest neighbor. I found it online, and it seemed perfect, quiet, secluded, and just the kind of place I needed to escape from the noise and stress of the city. But I didn't expect to find the graveyard. The graveyard was old. The tombstones were covered in weeds, barely visible through the thick brush. The cabin was up on a hill, and from the porch, I could see the graveyard stretching out below me, silent and still, surrounded by dark trees. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as the sun started setting, something felt off. It was like the place was watching me. That night, after I ate, I decided to go for a walk in the woods. The trees were tall, blocking out most of the moonlight, but I could still see the path ahead. I didn't mean to end up in the graveyard, but somehow I found myself there. It wasn't far from the cabin, maybe a 10-minute walk, but I hadn't planned on going. When I reached the edge of the graveyard, I stopped. It was eerily quiet, and for some reason, I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. I stood there for a minute, looking at the gravestones. Some were broken, some barely standing, and I could see dates on a few of them, some going back to the 1800s. But then something caught my eye. In the back, half hidden behind a big tree, was a grave that looked new. The stone wasn't old, and the name on it was still clear, even though it seemed like it had been carved recently. I felt a pull of curiosity, and I walked over. It didn't seem to belong. It was too new, like it was out of place. I crouched down to get a better look and touched the stone. The moment my hand brushed against it, I felt it. The air around me shifted, cold, wrong. It felt like the ground itself was moving, like something was there, something I couldn't see. The pressure around me grew heavier, like something was about to happen. I stood up quickly, ready to leave, but just as I turned, I heard a soft thud, like something had dropped to the ground. My heart jumped, and I looked back toward the stone. For a second, I thought I saw the dirt near it shift, like something was moving beneath the earth. I couldn't explain it, but I suddenly had this horrible feeling, like I was being watched. I didn't know why, but I felt like I had to leave. Right then, I didn't look back as I ran through the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept running until I reached the cabin, slamming the door behind me and locking it as fast as I could. I didn't sleep that night, not a wink. I kept the lights off, not daring to look out the windows. The feeling of being watched, of something waiting for me, was too strong. I felt like something was right outside the cabin, waiting for me to make a mistake. It was real. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't alone. The next morning, I didn't waste any time. I packed up and left before the sun even came up. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the image of that grave or the feeling that something had followed me from that graveyard. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the thought wouldn't go away. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I looked up the cemetery online, but I couldn't find anything about a new grave. It was all old news except for one strange comment. Someone had left a message saying they had felt a strange presence near the back of the graveyard, the same spot where I had been. They mentioned hearing things they couldn't explain, but what really got to me was what they said at the end. It's not a place to go alone. I don't know what I felt that night in the woods, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't human. And the next time I even think about going near that cabin again, I won't be alone. It was supposed to be a calm weekend at the cabin, just me and my ex-husband, surrounded by the quiet of the woods. We decided to try and be civil, even though everything between us had fallen apart. The cabin was far from the nearest town, tucked away in the forest, so all we could hear was the wind and the occasional sound of a twig breaking. We didn't talk much, each of us keeping to our own space. I took the bedroom upstairs, and he stayed downstairs in the room by the kitchen. The cabin itself was nice, a place we'd rented years ago, but this time the woods felt different. The trees looked darker, the air thicker, even though it was still daylight. It was like the shadows stretched longer than they should have, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. That evening, after dinner, we both went to our separate corners of the cabin. I was sitting on the couch, reading a book when I heard the first noise. A loud thump, like something heavy hitting the floor downstairs. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling, but then I heard footsteps, slow and heavy. My heart started to race. It was too quiet for it to be nothing. I stood up and glanced down the stairs, but I couldn't see anything from where I was. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the cabin was dead silent. Then, a soft scraping sound came from the kitchen. My mind was racing. Was it my ex down there? Or maybe an animal? I hesitated but decided to go check. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, my breath caught. There, in the kitchen doorway, was my ex-husband. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring into the dark. "Are you okay?" I asked, but he didn't respond. He was completely still, his eyes locked on something beyond me. I turned to look, thinking he might be staring out the window, but the trees outside were barely moving in the wind. Everything looked normal, yet the air felt heavy. "What is it?" I asked again, but there was still no answer. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud crash from the back door. My blood turned cold. Something was out there. I grabbed my ex's arm and pulled him toward the front door, the only way out. But the door wouldn't open. It felt like someone was pushing against it from the other side, keeping it shut. I stepped back, panic flooding through me. The scraping sound was louder now, closer, like something was moving across the floor. I was sure I had locked the back door earlier. So why did it sound like someone was trying to get in? Then the lights flickered. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter, my hands shaking. I turned it on and aimed it at the back door, but all it did was cast long shadows on the walls. The scraping stopped, but I could feel something was wrong, like the air itself had changed. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. I turned to my ex, but he was gone. I didn't hear him leave, but he wasn't in the kitchen anymore. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I couldn't stay here any longer. I rushed to the front door and tried again to force it open, but it felt like something was pushing back from the outside. I ran to the windows, hoping to see him, but there was no sign of him anywhere. He had to be nearby, right? Then, I heard movement in the trees, something or someone moving fast in the darkness. My stomach dropped. I looked out into the woods and saw a figure standing just outside the cabin. It wasn't my ex-husband. The person or thing wasn't moving, just standing there watching me. I froze, unable to breathe. The figure didn't make a sound, just stood in the dark. I slowly turned off the flashlight, not wanting to be seen. The rustling stopped, and I could hear the footsteps move away, but they didn't sound like they were going far. They were just fading into the trees. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave the cabin. I stayed in the kitchen, waiting, staring at the back door, the silence almost unbearable. Time seemed to stretch on, but the sounds outside never came back. It was like the world had gone still. When the sun finally came up, I couldn't bring myself to move. I hadn't slept at all. I couldn't stop looking at the door, listening for any sign of my ex, but nothing came. The whole place felt wrong, like something was off, and I couldn't explain it. I waited as long as I could, and finally, when I couldn't stand the silence anymore, I left the cabin. My ex's car was gone. His things were gone too, as if he'd just up and vanished. I didn't know what to think. He was there one moment and then he wasn't. I looked around the cabin, feeling like I was being watched, but there was nothing. I'll never forget that night. Whoever or whatever was out there with me wasn't human. And to this day, I still feel like it's watching me. Every time I hear the wind, every time a twig snaps in the distance, I wonder if it's waiting for me to come back.